Hi, everybody. I really wish this were under different circumstances. But in a strange way, doing this in such a weird way together really does align nicely with this time of year, with Purim coming, this Jewish opposite day when things are actually supposed to be completely upside down and we're supposed to pretend and perform and wear masks and flip the script. So I just invite everybody to take a real Purim this year. Not like last Purim when the world actually did flip upside down, but maybe a Purim flip to get the world right side up again. I'm really happy to be here with you in this very Purim-y way. So this week we read both Parshat Tetzaveh, all about the priestly garments, these beautiful vestments of holiness, the Bigdei Kodesh for Moses' brother Aaron in his service as the high priest, and also the Scroll of Esther. We also read the Scroll of Esther with the story of Purim. And these two pieces of Torah really go together quite nicely in a certain way. The timing really makes sense because there are few times elsewhere in the Torah where we focus so much on human appearances, how someone should look, in a way that's seemingly, apparently, maybe not really, but so superficial. The Torah describes Aaron's priestly vestments as being lechavod ultiferet, for honor and for glory. They're supposed to inspire reverence and respect. Everyone's supposed to know that the Bigdei Kodesh, these garments of holiness, are a big deal. And the Talmud picks up on the fact that these exact words, kavod and tiferet, at the very beginning of our parsha in describing these priestly vestments, also come up right at the beginning of the Scroll of Esther in describing how King Ahasuerus puts on this 6-month-long banquet to celebrate the honor and glory and wealth and amazing majesty of his kingdom. And the Talmud in Masechet Megillah, the tractate that's actually about Purim, it picks up on this language parallel, the fact that kavod and tiferet describe both of these situations. It says that Rabbi Yossi Bar Hanina used to teach that the parallel language meant that King Ahasuerus was actually wearing the priestly vestments, which is, of course, a terrible desecration. And Rashi comments, actually, the medieval commentator Rashi from the 10th century comments that Ahasuerus only had the garments on him because he took them from Jerusalem, presumably from the destroyed temple. So there's really a sense of profanity here. It's a flip that's very much in the spirit of the upside downness of Purim. But it's really interesting. King Ahasuerus basically going as the high priest to his own Purim party, wearing the priestly vestments as a Purim costume. And I have to say, I think there's actually something so sad about this. Beyond the fact of the desecration and the cultural appropriation and all these really intense images of this Persian king, who's, by the way, days away from being convinced to condemn his Jewish subjects to death, that he would be wearing the Israelite Bigdei Kodesh, it seems, the priestly garments. It's so disrespectful. And on the other hand, there's also on a personal, internal level, something so sad, thinking about this buffoon king who somehow subconsciously maybe actually wants to be a high priest. He's actually kind of into them. Maybe it's not all just bravado and showing that he can wear the garments of these disempowered people. Maybe it's just the deal with Purim costumes, that the truth comes out. And he's walking around like he's so cool wearing the conquered Israelites' sacred swag, but he's obviously an insecure guy. He needs a 6-month banquet to celebrate everything. And that makes me think of Aaron, actually, wearing these Bigdei Kodesh. Aaron, too, really wants to be a high priest, I would imagine. I would imagine when he puts on these clothes, he feels a sense of fraudulence, maybe. Right after basically overseeing the sin of the golden calf, he has to put on these garments that reflect unbelievable majesty. He has to put them on. And his whole life becomes about appearances. We sing a song on Yom Kippur, Mare Kohen. We're so happy about the appearance of the priest. Just the appearance. His life becomes all about appearances, and I can't help but wonder if he's actually inside, just like maybe Achashverosh, maybe not. Maybe Achashverosh is less aware of it, but Aaron and Achashverosh maybe are feeling on a human level this deep sense of inadequacy that I believe we all feel on some level. It's not just the imposter syndrome of wondering what people would think if they really knew the truth of who we are inside, but how that fear is combined with this really pure and vulnerable wish that we'd actually live up to those highest ideals. These priestly garments must have been so heavy. Kavod also connotes such a sense of weightiness. Literally and spiritually so heavy, they might have exacerbated this part of the human condition that makes us so vulnerable to a feeling of fraudulence. These garments are a catch size 22. Huge. And this is actually true about garments in general, about clothing in general. I first learned from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, one of those whom we've lost in this past year. First learned from him that beged, which means garment, and bagad, which means deception or treachery, spelled exactly the same way because they go together. There are all these textile texts where people are using clothes to deceive in one way or another, or clothes become a symbol of this discrepancy between appearance and reality. And it's just so sad. It's so sad. Rabbi Sachs says that we're the only animals actually who do wear clothes, whose appearance is fabricated, is made. We wear clothes because we're self-conscious. And that makes us feel even worse because we feel like we're literally involved in a cover-up. And I wasn't joking about the catch-22 part, because in terms of beged, garment, bagad, deception, it turns out that nakedness isn't really that much easier. We literally aren't comfortable in our own skin on some level. In Hebrew, arum, which comes up at the last verse of chapter 2 of Genesis, as in Adam and Eve are arum, they are naked in the garden, and at that time they're not embarrassed. Next verse, first verse of chapter 3, and the snake was the most cunning, the most arum of all the animals. So arum, nakedness, and arum, cunning, have this same dual meaning on some level. Even in our own skins, we might end up feeling that we're hiding something true about who we are on the inside. It's not just skin deep. It's not just about appearances. So this whole idea of King Achashverosh coming to his banquet wearing the priestly vestments, it just feels very Freudian on some level. And Purim is pretty Freudian in general. Like I said before, about the truth coming out through the costumes we choose. The mystical masters of the Zohar actually read a Freudian slip into the relationship between the high priest and Purim, because the high priest would always wear the priestly garments, especially on Yom Kippur, which the Bible calls Yom HaKippurim. And the Zohar says Yom HaKippurim, that sounds a lot like Yom HaKi, the day that is like Purim. It's almost as if underneath there's something that's trying to express itself. There's a Freudian slip in the very language of these holidays and how they're related. And actually, the last time I was in this synagogue giving a sermon was on my bar mitzvah, speaking about the parsha where we learn of the Yom Kippur ritual. So there's a lot of Yom HaKippurim karma going on for me, I will say for sure. And speaking of Yom Kippur and the rabbis and being Freudian, there's an amazing moment at the very beginning of the late, great Rabbi Alan Liu's book, This Is Real, and You Are Completely Unprepared, where he discusses how a student once asked Buckminster Fuller, who was the most important figure of the 20th century? And Fuller answered very quickly, Freud, of course. And the student was surprised and said, really, why not Einstein, for example? And Buckminster Fuller said, Freud gave us the core insight that so many insights of the 20th century, including maybe even Einstein's, were based on. That the invisible is more important than the visible. And Rabbi Liu comes and says, hey, that sounds a lot like Judaism's core idea also, that the invisible is more important than the visible. And I have to say, I think I might actually disagree with the wording a little bit. For me, it feels like it's less about how the invisible is more important than the visible, and a little more about how the invisible becomes visible. How the truth makes its way to the surface, that Judaism and Freud and Einstein, they're all looking at how the invisible makes its way to the surface and manifests. How invisible forces combine with and form matter to become something visible, to translate the invisible into the visible. And Jewish mysticism expresses this in a particularly beautiful way. It's connected to our discussion directly. That the world is just divinity in garb. The world comes into existence from Aleph to Bet Gimel Daled, the first four letters of the alphabet the Baal Shem Tov taught, the great founder of Hasidism, is about going from the ineffable, invisible Aleph to Bet Gimel Daled, Beged, or Bagad. That divinity is garmenting itself in order to come into creation, in order to form the world. And the idea here is that light can't get in any other way. So coming back to our idea of the catch-22, it's not just that this issue of clothing and feeling like we're hiding something and can't even escape it in nakedness. It's not only about human nature, it's actually just an unavoidable double bind, because that's how it works. That's how divinity enters into the world and becomes the world in the Jewish mystical consciousness. Every level of us is clothed because it's impossible for the divinity to get into the world without getting garbed up and becoming visible. The only way out is through garments. And it's really perfect Purim Torah for our time, because these mystical texts don't just use the words of clothing to describe this process, but also veils and screens and masks. And the word for screen is also the verb to mask in Hebrew, which is masach, which is, I think, a cognate. So we're obviously in this Purim and pandemic territory where all these ideas of how divinity and images of divinity come into our lives through veils and screens has become so much more concrete. Just like we're all coming into each other's lives right now over Zoom. But in this upside-down virtual world of ours, all of these feelings about who we truly are versus how we appear can be even more acute as we present ourselves on Zoom, both hidden behind a screen and also more vulnerable and visible than ever, able to set our backgrounds and set up the image, maybe even to turn off our cameras, but also oh so visible. We are literally the embodied challenge of how hard it is for something that is invisible to become visible. Because we are divinity on the inside. That struggle is that point of divinity inside of us. This process of garmenting allows divine light to come into the world, but it also conceals. It tones down the light. It might even cause some shame that the light is a little bit too much for the world. So I just want to say to myself and to everyone, to all of you, everyone listening, that we are all in this together. We are all wearing Big Day Kodesh. We're all wearing garments of holiness. We are Big Day Kodesh. We are garments of holiness. We don't have to put them on or worry about being adequate. We don't have to fit into them or try to fit in at all, because everything and everyone, including ourselves and each other, and not just every Zoom rectangle, but every pixel on every screen, is bringing these images of the divine into our lives. Even the light carrying these images into our eyes are all ultimately, in the real world and online, all ultimately pure blessing in disguise.